One of the most critical steps of the data incident is essentially just to start moving. Many times when an organization has an incident, you have those moments of panic and, kind of freezing up. The most critical point is to start moving to get the assistance you need. We're seeing threat actors and cyber criminals use AI to their advantage every single day. It's become where the email actually sounds like it's really coming from the person who you think it's coming from. There are no spelling and grammatical errors. How do we get by wire fraud without actually walking down the hall, seeing the person, but you can touch their arm and say, did you send me this email to wire money? The guidance is jump in, like all hands on deck. We need more.
This is the Litigator's Edge, the podcast where smart strategy, practical innovation, and real-world experience come together to move litigation forward. Each week, we sit down with attorneys, legal tech leaders, and trusted advisors who are rethinking how great legal work gets done. You'll hear how law firms are building a competitive advantage. These conversations are grounded, insightful, and designed to help you refine how you work and how you win. Here is your host, Aniket Sawant.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of The Litigator's Edge, the podcast where innovative attorneys reveal the strategies that have transformed their legal practice. My name is Aniket Sawant, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Threadio. My guest today is a modern-day crisis counsel and a leading voice at the critical intersection of law, technology, and cybersecurity. She guides organizations through their most high-stakes moments, from navigating the immediate chaos of ransomware attacks and data breaches to advising boards on mitigating litigation risk. As a former entrepreneur and educator and a sitting judge, she brings a rare and powerful combination of expertise to her work. It's my pleasure to welcome Jacqueline Goralczyk to the podcast. Welcome, Jacqueline. Thank you for being here.
And again, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Likewise. Jacqueline, as you know, I love to start all of these shows with asking my guest about either a fun fact about themselves or a cringe joke that they may have. Which one will it be for you and what is it?
It's going to be cringy.
That's great. I love it.
It's actually something that happened very recently and something that I've shared with a few of my colleagues. So when I transferred over to a fully remote law firm, one of the ideas behind a fully remote law firm is that you're supposed to have this much better work-life balance. So I decided that as an adult, I was going to start taking horse riding lessons because I've always loved horses and thought, what better time? I have more time now. And so on my second ride, my instructor said, put the horse back in the cage or in the corral. And I got into the corral and my horse got spooked and kind of crunched me into the electric fence. So, for probably about a total of 4 seconds, I was being electrocuted, which felt like about 35 minutes to me. And my instructor came out and was like, oh, you got struck by the fence, right? And I was like, yeah, does no one warn you? But going forward, I'm like, this is an anecdote for both horse riding and life in that do not pin yourself between a 1,000-pound horse and an electric fence.
Words to live by, that's for sure. Yeah. That's well, I'm glad you're okay. But yeah, I'm sure it must have been quite surprising in the moment. Well, thank you for sharing that, Jacqueline. So next question, I don't know how to quite segue from that to this question, but I'll try. I think of every attorney who makes the time to be on this podcast as a superhero, and every superhero is an origin story. And you have quite an interesting background with yours. So can you please share a little bit more about your origin story?
Absolutely. So I started my career after undergrad in 2004, working for a real estate law firm. I was a paralegal at a real estate firm and then moved to an escrow agent at a title agency. Ultimately, a couple years later, opening my own title agency. So I spent about maybe 8 years in real estate before I went to law school. So the last, 4 or 5 owning my title agency. And then in 2008, things changed in New York where we could no longer close loans as a title agent. So it had to be through an attorney. And at that point, a couple of years later, my son was turning 1 and I decided time to go to law school. So, which, horrible timing. So I did. I went to law school. I graduated and continued in real estate for a couple of years. And then in about 2017, law firms, title agencies, kind of everybody in the real estate world started really getting hit hard with wire fraud and other types of cybercrime. So the law school that I went to, Albany Law School, started offering a cybersecurity and data privacy LLM concentration. And I had recently worked on a couple of cybersecurity cases at that point and decided to go back to Albany Law and get the cyber LLM. So I was the first graduate of that program. And then in 2019, I opened my own law firm. And then we had the pandemic, obviously. So that was a very interesting 3 to 4 years where we were like, oh, it's kind of sink or swim. Are we going to make it? But we focused a lot in real estate. So luckily the real estate market stayed strong through the pandemic. And then in 2024, I really said, it's time to make the full move over to cyber law. And that's when I joined the current firm that I'm at, Pearson Ferdinand.
That sounds great. There's so many interesting angles to that. I'll start with maybe one that might have been potentially a turning point to where you are today, right? And so you mentioned in 2017, the firm that you were with was hit with a lot of wire fraud. Was there a particular catalyzing event or something that happened either with the firm or in technology in general that triggered that, or was it just something that you happened to see?
Yeah. So the firm that I was at didn't get hit with wire fraud, but just generally in industry, we were seeing more and more of it. And I think it was a result of increased communication by email, increased reliance on technology, and increased ability of social engineering. So cyber criminals were really, I don't want to say perfecting social engineering, but certainly using it on a wider basis. And real estate transactions are ripe for fraud. So unfortunately, we were seeing a lot more of it and seeing organizations that really, once they were hit with wire fraud, they didn't know what to do. So there was certainly that crossover between all the time I spent in real estate and, moving into cyber, where I was like, I hope that I have the ability to assist.
Yep, makes sense. That's interesting. So it seemed like there were a bunch of trends that happened to be sort of going in one direction at a particular time, and then the maturity point or the inflection point happened to be around 2017, which is when you saw this more broadly in the industry.
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
Now obviously now you sit at the intersection of law and technology and crisis management. And so as I was reflecting on our conversation here, Jacqueline, I was thinking, I would assume, and please tell me if this is incorrect, but I would assume that there's two types of days in the life for you. One is the regular sort of peacetime, when you're doing all the activities that you're doing, in terms of advising companies and so forth on how to mitigate risk proactively. And then there's maybe the wartime, which is, hey, something has happened and now, you're all hands on deck and doing what you're doing. Can you maybe walk us through each of those days in the life?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually funny that you call it peacetime and wartime, because that's what we use in our firm. We offer peacetime and wartime services. So unfortunately, I don't do as much peacetime work as I'd like to, because the wartime work is so abundant, which, is a reflection of the state of our world. But I would say a normal day, looks different every single day, because it depends on, what new matters are coming in. Are we seeing more ransomware? Are we seeing more business email compromise, different types of cyber attacks, and then what stage each individual organization is within their matter. So it might be, if a matter comes in where it's a very active ransomware, then it might be spending the next 3 days deeply involved with that organization to make sure that they are protected, to make sure that the incident is contained, and then potentially doing communications, with that threat actor. As it moves down the chain of the incident, then, each day again is a little bit different, because it depends on the obligations of the organization. So if an organization has unfortunately lost a large amount of data, they might be in the data mining process, which can take weeks or months, for an outside vendor to go through the data that's potentially been subject to unauthorized access. If the organization is in the notification portion, then we could be dealing with notices to individuals, correspondence with regulators, federal or state regulators, and then ultimately watching the matter through the end to make sure that all loose ends are tied up. For peacetime services, our firm had to expand off, and we have an entire group that does just peacetime services. Many peacetime services originate from wartime services, because when an organization has an incident, that's kind of the prime time for them to understand that they have to do more proactively.
Makes sense. If I draw the analogy between a data breach or cybersecurity incident of the kind that you handle so frequently, and say like a medical emergency, is there like an equivalent of a golden hour in terms, or golden 24, 48, whatever number of hours, are critical for doing a certain set of actions on behalf of the client? And if so, what does that look like? So not so much on an hour by hour basis, but just in broad chunks of time, and how that changes as the hours pass.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most critical steps of the data incident is essentially just to start moving. Many times when an organization has an incident, you have those moments of panic and kind of freezing up. And what do we do if we're unprepared, if we don't have an incident response plan in place? I think the most critical point is to start moving to get the assistance you need. So bring in the incident response attorney, which is where we step in, get a digital forensics firm so that they can start helping you to make sure that the incident is contained, to start investigating what exactly has happened, and then kind of moves down the line from there. So there's an urgency in the beginning, certainly to make sure that everything, like I said, is contained, and then there's a more natural flow. But I think getting over that initial hurdle of fear and anxiety is definitely a critical piece.
Makes sense. Thinking about the fear and anxiety that affects, even, I would assume, even senior leaders as they're leading their companies through such an incident. What are some of the common mistakes or errors that senior leaders might make, and that you would advise against making, especially in those first few hours or days after an incident?
Yeah, I would say that one of the most critical pieces is making sure that the senior leaders are truly involved in what's going on. Many times we see that an organization is going to delegate the responsibility to different sectors of the organization, whether it be the IT team, HR, the CFO. There's kind of a gamut of individuals that we normally see. And I think it's really critical to have those senior leaders in on the initial calls, understanding what's actually going on, understanding what potential legal notification obligations they may have, so that as we move through the incident, every piece isn't a surprise or takes longer to get authority because we have to get them up to speed. So I think that's, if I could give any advice, that's the most critical, is making sure that they're involved and understand what's going on.
Makes sense. Jacqueline, what your bio says that you're passionate about demystifying cybersecurity, and there's many angles and attributes to that. And one of the most recent ones, and obviously it's the elephant in every room we're all in, is AI. And so, what are your views on AI in terms of its developments, both from an offensive perspective, meaning what threat actors are using, as well as from a defensive perspective, and how do you communicate these with your clients?
So I can't necessarily take credit for this theory, but I heard an individual speaking recently that said that you really cannot have the use of offensive AI without defensive AI. So they go hand in hand. Essentially, we're seeing threat actors and cyber criminals use AI to their advantage every single day. And if I can go back to 2017, where we saw social engineering, and we could easily say to an organization, if you see spelling errors in the email, or if you see that the email has a lowercase I where there should be a capital I, those are great indicators that this didn't come from the person you think it came from, and it could be social engineering. Fast forward to today, I mean, with the ability to use AI even for those types of phishing campaigns, it's become where the email actually sounds like it's really coming from the person who you think it's coming from. There are no spelling and grammatical errors. So just in that period of time, we've seen such a development in that type of attack. And then, on the flip side, organizations are going to have to use AI as a protection mechanism, because they just won't be able to handle the number and complexity of the threats that they're going to be facing, I think, without the use of AI as a defensive mechanism, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, and it's fascinating. Many years ago, when I had undertaken cybersecurity training as part of the prior organization that I was with, I remember the whole spelling errors and all of that. And what's ironic is that LLMs are the opposite. They make no spelling errors. It's almost like if you want to see if something was written by a human, you may want to look for the occasional typo even. So
that's exactly right.
So now that is fascinating. And then, of course, the ways in which you can easily train an LLM on somebody's writing style and all that. Yeah, I'm sure that's quite a bit of a challenge. So given what are you seeing in terms of the broad buckets of attacks that maybe you've seen over the past year or 2 years? Can you categorize them, and how much of them are AI? Is that something that you can maybe share with our audience?
I don't know if I could put a definitive percentage on what would be AI, but certainly, um, you know, we're still seeing a large amount of business email compromises originating from social engineering, from phishing attacks. So those things are staying semi-similar. I think the use of deepfakes, I think the use of voice recordings using AI for voice impersonation, that's definitely ramped up. And it's the same scenario where 5 years ago we could say, okay, make sure you call the CEO if they send you an email and ask you to wire money. Make sure you call them and make sure it was them. And now we have impersonation of CEOs. So it's it's almost like I was recently in a presentation where they were saying, how do we get by it? How do we get by wire fraud without actually walking down the hall, seeing the person? You can touch their arm and say, did you send me this email to wire money? And we don't have that perfected yet.
What are some steps that you're seeing, some promising steps, they may be early, that you're seeing and that you're maybe advising your clients on in terms of combating at least some of these? I mean, can you share some counteroffensive just strategies at a high level that seem to be working, at least as of today?
Yeah, I mean, employee training is always going to be very important. Employees understanding the threats. And even if, some employee training is kind of like the hokey, you get the video you have to watch, but it's really a larger campaign of understanding what's going on out there and being on high alert. So I think employee training is always going to be very valuable. In addition to that, I mean, I think having leadership communicate with IT, with your chief information officer, with kind of all of the parties involved in the risks that we're concerned about is also very important. One of the themes that we often see is that an organization will have an outsourced managed services provider that they rely on heavily, that has set up their infrastructure. But then there's been little communication between the organization and the MSP over the years. They haven't upgraded their defenses. They haven't spent money on infrastructure. They haven't even upgraded their controls and existing infrastructure. So I think there has to be open communication and really an, an exchange of ideas between IT and leadership to say, this is what we're worried about, and these are the things that we need to try to protect against. It's very often that when we're in the middle of an incident, there's this feeling of like, oh, we were going to do this in 6 months, or we were planning on taking these steps, or now that we know, we'll implement this. And I think those are conversations that have to happen immediately. And then the third thing I would say is having a tried and true incident response plan. A lot of time, money, energy, and data is wasted in a poorly planned incident response. The value of a tabletop exercise, making sure that everyone understands what's actually happening during that incident, making sure that the plan is tested and we know who's going to be involved, we know who's going to be in the room, because it's inevitable that most organizations are going to have some sort of incident. So making sure we understand who's actually going to be involved when the day comes is super important.
Makes a lot of sense. And it's actually a great segue into my next question, which is, you mentioned examples of companies that, said that they were going to invest in infrastructure and they hadn't gotten around to it. And sometimes it's too late, and hopefully in most cases it's not. A couple of questions on that. One is, how do you convince, senior leadership, boards, etc., to actually proactively invest in that infrastructure to improve resilience in advance of an incident occurring? And related to that, what sort of misconceptions or resistance have you encountered in making such investments on the client side?
Yeah, it's not to make light of it to answer that question, but it's a challenge. When business leaders are looking at potentially spending dollars on improving their business or rolling out a new product or whatever it may be that translates into real dollars that they can see versus upgrading to a different endpoint detection or upgrading their firewall or things like that, where they just can't see the ROI, as quickly. It is challenging, and especially, in an economy where everybody is pinching pennies and, trying to make the dollar last. It's very hard to say, or for people to buy into spending their dollars there. unfortunately, it's easier for individuals to see that ROI after an incident has occurred because they never want to be in that position again. So after they've had some sort of incident, their firewall is getting upgraded and those types of things. And I don't want to make light of that because any improvement is great. We always want them to take those steps so that it doesn't happen to them again, and we can minimize, any loss going forward. It is a challenge to convince leaders to do that.
That makes sense. Moving from businesses to law. So in terms of the laws that are on the books and maybe some that are coming down the line, what do you see as some of the biggest trends in laws that could support your work and the work that you do for your clients, over the next 3 to 5 years? Are there the existing legal framework good enough, or are there other things that can be done and are being done?
Yeah, I think the legal framework in the US is interesting. And over the last 10 years, we've certainly seen an influx of privacy related regulations. So I think probably California was the first one. And then kind of spreading across the US, we're seeing state-based privacy regulations. If you look at from a cyber law perspective, from a data breach perspective, we have 50 different regulations for notification of a data security incident. And I think we're going to see the exact same thing with AI. So I don't think we're going to see a federal AI regulation, just like we haven't seen a federal privacy regulation or a federal data breach. So I think we're going to see another, spread of 50 plus different AI regulations. It makes it, difficult to manage from a legal perspective, but it also really makes it difficult to manage from an internal compliance perspective. So small to medium-sized businesses that offer a product or their services outside of their home state, which is a lot of businesses, have a big compliance risk and a big compliance burden, and that's going to continue, I think.
So regardless of the merits of this individual law, there's no EU style GDPR coming anytime soon in the United States. So it sounds like
I don't see it. Maybe I'm the naysayer, but I don't see it.
Got it. Looking ahead, and obviously we're moving in, this is a fast moving time with technology, with AI and all the other things that are going on. What are some emerging threats? And it could be AI, it could be, some of these regulations, it could even be things like quantum computing or whatever else might be out there. What do you think is maybe underestimated by, some of the clients that you might speak to in terms of threats that they should be aware of?
So that's a really great question, because I think the thing that is underrated for clients are the basics. So regardless of the threat and regardless of what the incident entails, it's the basics of an organization of what type of data do you deal with? Where is your data? How do you protect your data? Is your data backed up? It's those types of kind of baseline questions that, regardless of if it's, a phishing or a social engineering or an AI threat, it's still the same, context of information that we're dealing with, in the same, path that we're going to go down, where organizations are kind of like, small to medium are like, oh, we don't have, the level of data that would put us at risk for some sort of big, threat. But it is. I mean, we see, one person or mom and pop businesses all the way up to huge organizations. So I think it's really doesn't matter what the external threat is. It's more of the internal planning and what's going on internally.
Understood. For the litigators in our audience, what might be an oversight that they might sort of be prone to when they're brought in after an incident response is complete? Because sometimes, unfortunately, after a major incident, there may be litigation. And so how can a litigator coming in to support the work of a company better leverage the work of someone such as yourself as they prepare for that litigation?
That's a really good question. It's something that we talk about internally all the time, because, like I said, we have separate practice groups that deal with kind of the gamut of these issues. So, I'm on the incident response team, but we have the peacetime services, the policies and procedures. We also have the litigation piece. And I think one of the really important pieces is having that conversation between incident response and litigation, because we are seeing a huge uptick in litigation. And and I'm not a litigator, so I want to caveat, advice to any litigator. One of the things that we are seeing is that uptick in class action litigations related to data breaches. And from the perspective of the litigator versus the incident response attorney, which comes in at the incident, collaborating on that types of information, as far as like from the litigator's perspective, what could an incident response attorney potentially do to minimize that risk for the client that then the litigator can use, to support their position going forward, I think is really important. One of the, I would say maybe the downfalls right now is that most of these cases none of these cases have been brought to actual trials. Most of them settle. So we don't have that depth of case law that supports litigation in the data breach realm. So I think that's going to be an interesting, if that changes over the next 3 to 5 years. We'll see if anybody brings one all the way to the end.
Yep, makes sense. This has been a great conversation, Jacqueline. Just a couple of quick questions to wrap us up here. What advice would you give to a young attorney, maybe they're fresh out of law school, maybe a first or second year associate, who is maybe considering jumping into, I'll call them the incredibly fast moving waters of the field that you're in? What guidance would you give them, given where you stand?
Yeah, I mean, the guidance is jump in, like all hands on deck. We need more. And I think that the newer generation of attorneys is going to bring newer perspective. They've grown up with technology. They're going to understand it. And I would say one of the biggest hurdles when I switched my practice area is really getting a strong understanding of technology. And they might have that advantage growing up so much more with technology. The other thing that I would say is embrace AI, because although we don't want to use AI as the actual attorney, we want to use it to support our legal process. And we want to use it. I think that young attorneys just out of law school are going to find value in being able to really embrace AI and use it well and assist I don't want to say older generation of attorneys, but in reality, if for instance, you're taking the big law path out of law school and you're going to work for a huge firm, being able to really use AI to be efficient and knowledgeable is going to be very helpful.
That's great. Can you actually share a couple of examples of how you think attorneys of any age or experience level could use AI in your legal practice? I know we focus most of this conversation on the threat side, but yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I'll just give you an example. I think, on a daily basis, I use AI. I use it as a starting point. It's kind of like, to me, and this, my opinion only, is AI for me is like a supercharged Google. So if I have a question or I'm not sure where to start on something where I used to potentially spend hours investigating, AI really gives you the edge as far as a starting point. And I say that, very firmly that it's a starting point. It's not to be used to, it's not the end all be all. You still have to check the sources and make sure everything's accurate. But it certainly gives me a starting point where, I would potentially be wasting time previously. It also can give you, for instance, if an attorney is trying to write a letter that, is really stumping them, you can put it in AI and you can get a draft of a letter, which again is a starting point. So where you might be stuck for a period of time as to what direction you want to go down, that becomes very valuable. Certainly for research. And then also marketing is very different now as an attorney. There's less in-person events. It's different than it was, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So I use AI a lot for content generation and different forms of marketing that is very valuable, saves time and expense. But we didn't have that before.
That's great. Especially the last one I think will be quite valuable for attorneys who are looking to expand their practice, their business, wherever they may be. Jacqueline, so I want to bring it back to where we started from. So you've obviously had a multifaceted career, including the horse riding, and your prior work, owning a title insurance company and your work in real estate. One thing we did not touch upon was that you're also, in addition to all the things that you do and that we discussed, you're also a sitting municipal court judge. Can you please share a little bit about that role that you play?
So my role as a judge, kind of happened upon me. It wasn't necessarily a goal, but it has given me the ability to provide a service to my community. And it certainly has, where the intersection of law and technology is fast moving, criminal law is less so. And I think that it's really given me an opportunity to interact with all different parts of the population. But I think there's a lot of overlap between individuals who might find themselves in a municipal court and individuals who might find themselves in a data security incident. There's a level of panic and concern, and I definitely try to bring a level of calm and understanding to both facets of my career.
That's wonderful. I love how you drew the parallels between what would on the surface be two very different sort of roles, and I appreciate you sharing that. Final question for you, Jacqueline. Is there a question that I should have asked you but I didn't?
That's a good one. I can't think of anything, off the top of my head.
And that's fine.
Yeah, I don't think I have one that we didn't kind of hit on.
That's great. Well, Jacqueline, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, insightful, and timely conversation on all the various areas of your expertise. So I really appreciate your time and insights. I'm sure our audience will as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
The Litigator's Edge podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.